Tonight, the Mueller probe heating up. That is, we have new information and important information about Paul Manafort that could be very damaging. And that info, it was released by his own attorneys. A former federal prosecutor, he'll join us to weigh in. Then the president speaks. Then the fact-checking begins, and they had a lot of work ahead of them. Last night's Oval Office address, no exception. We will separate fact from fiction. I'll also show you the very latest on the shutdown stalemate. Then our special report on the undocumented immigrants who have worked at Trump's golf course in Bedminster, New Jersey. We speak with some former workers, and they tell us what went on at that club. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thank you for joining us tonight. Now, ordinarily, the day after an Oval Office address from the Commander-in-Chief, it would be our lead story, but that would not be tonight. The shutdown, it does grind on, and neither side is budging an inch. We will talk a lot more about that in just a few minutes. But last night, it also yielded no new substance. Both sides, they look like they were making hostage tapes. That's why we're starting tonight with a development in the Russia probe, and I believe it's a big one. A lot happening here. We're going to begin, as we often do, with Paul Manafort. Attorneys for Trump's former campaign chairman just revealed, unintentionally, some damaging information about their client in an unredacted portion of a court filing. Now, this revolves around this guy, Konstantin Kilimnik. Now, the documents show that Manafort, he shared campaign polling data with his associate. By the way, the FBI has said that Kilimnik, he has ties to Russian intelligence that go way up the food chain. Also, Mueller's office says Manafort shockingly lied about all of this. This new information is raising even more questions about possible, if not definitive, collusion. Senator Mark Warner, he's one of the people raising such questions, the Virginia Democrat. He's vice chair of the Intelligence Committee.
This appears as the closest we've seen yet to real live actual collusion. Clearly Manafort was trying to collude with Russian agents. And the question is, what did the president know? What did Donald Trump know? Plus,
the man who's been overseeing the Russia investigation, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, he is leaving his post soon. He will reportedly step down after William Barr is confirmed, as is expected, as Attorney General. Now, speaking of Barr, his confirmation hearings, they'll begin this coming Tuesday, but a lot of people have questions, especially given his prior stated positions on independent investigations, etc. Chuck Schumer, New York Senator and the minority leader, he wants the president to withdraw the nomination. To Chuck, I say, don't hold your breath. Now, Schumer and a lot of people, they're upset that Barr wrote a memo that was critical of the Mueller probe. Take a listen.
The Senate, starting with the Judiciary Committee, should subject Mr. Barr's views to the strictest of scrutiny next week. And I still believe, after the revelations about Mr. Barr's unsolicited memo, President Trump ought to withdraw this nomination.
Again, don't wait by the phone, Chuck. A lot to unpack here, and for that, we go to good friend to the program, former federal prosecutor Roland Riopel. Let's start off with that unredacted bombshell. First off, what is it with Manafort and technology and attorneys who, you know, I'm not hiring to get me out of a traffic ticket? They did this to themselves, Roland.
They did, Richard, and I think this is just a classic example of how those of us who are a little longer in the tooth sometimes don't know how to use technology correctly and screw things up. I think, you know, this was a situation where somebody didn't use their Adobe program properly, and this stuff got disclosed.
Oops.
And it is fascinating stuff. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that, because I heard one member, a Republican on the Judiciary Committee, said, hey, listen, I got problems with Manafort, but there's really nothing to see here. Sure, he shared some polling data. What's the big deal? I'm hearing a lot of people say game, set, match when we're talking collusion, but more than that, we got to remember the timing. In 2016, in the middle of the campaign manager, Paul Manafort, sharing really critical data that there's no rationale why he would share this with a Russian operative, if you will, other than trying to impact an election. From your perspective, why is this such a big deal?
It is a big deal because it shows Manafort conspiring with Kilimnik, a person closely associated with the Kremlin and, very tight with the highest levels of Russian operatives, conspiring with Kilimnik to affect the outcome of the election. The information that Manafort provided to Kilimnik would allow the Russians or help the Russians to target the specific individuals in America with their social media stuff to influence the election. And they're effectively making a campaign donation by doing that, and that is totally illegal. So you have Manafort conspiring to commit a crime, and the only issue in the case now is who else knows about it? Who else was a conspirator in this? Did Manafort tell Trump about it? Hard to believe Trump didn't know this was happening, given his many, public announcements during the campaign that, Russia, if you're listening, why don't you dump those Hillary emails and stuff like that? Trump telegraphed that there was connection between him and the Russians. It's hard to believe he didn't know about this. And if he did, he is now an unindicted co-conspirator with Manafort to violate the campaign finance laws.
And
it's a
again,
bad thing.
Just to amplify what was unintentionally unredacted by the attorneys of Manafort, that's not all that Mueller, has here. There's a lot of the other correspondence that we didn't see that was redacted or wasn't even inadvertently put up there that will give even more clarity, one would think. All right, let's talk about comings and goings over at Justice. Looks like Rosenstein leaving and Barr coming in. First start with Barr, and I said, Schumer can want Trump to pull his nomination. It's not going to happen. I happen to think the votes are going to be there for confirmation. That said, even with the prior memos that Barr, this thing's too far along. Barr can't shut it down, really, if he wanted to. Democrats have subpoena power. They can just bring Mueller in front and basically say what he's found, right? Am I wrong?
I think that's right. I think that's right, Richard. I think that Barr's going to be confirmed. He's been Attorney General before. It's hard to see why he wouldn't be confirmed now. He'll get roasted. There'll be some very serious questions about, whether he's going to recuse himself and what was his conversation with Trump about this position and all that. He's going to have a rough go of it, but he'll be confirmed. But this thing is so far along. Yep. It would do no good to fire Mueller at this point. You're absolutely right. Congress will subpoena whatever Mueller's got. Mueller will tell him what he's got, and they'll be back in the same spot with even worse political consequences if you fire Mueller. So it's just not going to happen, I don't think.
Roland, I know it's too early. Obviously, we haven't even seen the report here. But do you think history is going to look back at Rod Rosenstein and say, there's the guy who put a line in the sand, who dealt with what I'm sure we'll learn in the books in the years to come, what went on behind the scenes, and he didn't bend? Is he right now an underrated figure in all of this for what he didn't do?
Yeah. Richard, I think, like everyone other than perhaps Mueller in this cast of characters, Rosenstein is not perfect. He is the guy who wrote the memo that got Comey fired, and that probably wasn't a great thing. But since that time, he has been a quiet hero to withstand the political pressures and winds that have blown around him. And he's allowed Mr. Mueller the space to do his job. And I do think while history will judge him to some degree for allowing himself to get sucked into the firing of Comey and that imbroglio, I think he will generally come out as a hero for giving Mueller the space that he needed.
Speaking of the space Mueller needs, obviously a lot happened in the midterms and specifically this week. New people got gavels, Schiff over at Intelligence and Nadler over at Judiciary. In addition to holding the gavels here, they got subpoena power. Do you think there's been communication where, and I know Schiff's already said, listen, we're not going to screw things up for the Mueller probe, but there is a bunch of different investigations or hearings that could be held, emoluments, violations, et cetera, that, you know, Nadler could say, you know, these are overdue questions that need to be asked, but those could open up other things. Let's say they get the tax returns. Inadvertently, that could show the hand of Mueller for where he'd be going. Do you think there's coordination with Mueller and the Dems to say, slow your roll, guys, let me get my report out and then do what you guys are going to do, or do they act completely separately?
I think there will be some coordination. Now, keep in mind, Richard, that Mueller is constrained in what he can say to Congress by the grand jury secrecy rules. Mueller's investigation, which is proceeded by way of grand jury, is largely secret because grand jury proceedings are required to be secret under the law. So there's a limited amount that Mueller can say to Congress. However, he and Congress will be very careful about witnesses that Congress subpoenas who may be cooperating with Mueller or that Mueller may want to obtain information from. There'll be talk about who it's appropriate for Congress to talk to now as opposed to later, because if Congress subpoenas a witness and if Congress gives that witness immunity, that will protect that witness from potential criminal prosecution in the future. That's what happened with Oliver North. So there'll be some coordination there to make sure that Congress does not inadvertently immunize someone that is a target of the Mueller investigation. But I think to a great degree, you know, there's so much that Congress can investigate that is really not within Mueller's purview. I think they can focus on some of that. And there's so many witnesses they can call, a guy like Papadopoulos, who's already been sentenced, who's no longer of interest to Mueller. So there's a great deal they can do over the next 4 or 5 months while Mueller wraps up.
I mean, there's so much I want to still get into, but I'm out of time. I got one last quick thing. In the next segment, I'm going to be sitting down going over what we heard last night, but I believe there's an inevitability where there's going to be no give from the president, no give from Democrats on the Hill relating to this wall and the government shutdown, and the president's going to invoke here, you know, basically a national emergency and invoke powers that a lot of people think are beyond his reach. If he does that, what settled law, or is there settled law that says he's, you know, definitely reaching outside his area code or he's within his purview, even if it's a manufactured crisis?
I do think there's pretty persuasive precedent that he would be overstepping his bounds, and I'm referring, of course, to President Truman's attempt to nationalize the steel industry during strikes in the 1950s during the Korean War. That was found to be beyond the president's power. I think this would also be found to be beyond the president's power, and I think the courts would shut it down. I think, frankly, if the president does this, it is another valid ground for impeachment of the president and potentially removal from office. We'll have to see what Congress's reaction to it is.
Add it to the list, Roland. Thank you for the time, as always. And
it's a pleasure to be here, Richard.
You got a belated Happy New Year to you. Now, you heard the subject I just talked about, where this thing may go relating to the shutdown and obviously the address last night. When we come back, we're going to head to D.C. for the very latest on said shutdown. And trust me, it ain't pretty. Both sides digging in, the president making even more outrageous claims today. We'll catch up on the latest and tell you where we think this may be headed.